Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our Spiritual Pilgrimage Workshop Series, our Sacred Traditions times God Box Talks, our Afro-Latinx and Africans, a Spiritual Reconnection. Today is our first workshop, Forming Afro-Indigenous Identities, Transcontinental Connections Before Columbus. My name is Sabine Blazin. I am the Director of Programs here at the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diasporic Institute. Our mission is in arts, culture, education, and we're a media organization that advances cultural equity, racial and social justice for African descendant communities. Our theme is exploring and understanding and have a deep relationship with our African diasporic community through a beautiful journey. One of our spiritual pillars is sacred traditions, and this is a series dedicated to advocating for the education and preservation of African-based spirituality. At this time, I would like us to take a quick moment of silence for our African and Indigenous diasporic ancestors, and also in honoring the land. Thank you for that. So special thanks to our panelists, Dr. Kenneth Dosar, our co-moderators and God Box Talks partners, Afia Reynolds, Gilbert Kobina Buhari, and the CCCADI team for making this all possible, and to you all, our extended family and attendees, for being here today. So at this time, I would like to now hand it over to our co-moderator, Afia Reynolds.
Hello, everyone. Greetings. My name is Afia Reynolds. I'm the co-associate director at God Box Foundation, and happy to be with you all this evening. The God Box Foundation is the first Pan-African interfaith and multi-faith organization in the world that embraces, celebrates, and promotes the religious and spiritual diversity of the Pan-African family. Our vision at God Box is to reconnect Africans on the continent and in the diaspora in the most intimate and sacred of ways in order to liberate ourselves from the mutual suspicion and self-hatred and the social injustices that plague the Pan-African family. One of the ways that we do this is through our God Box Talks, one of the programs that you're joining us for this evening. God Box Talks engages in rich religious and spiritual dialogues with spiritual and traditional faith leaders, scholars, and activists. It's in this spirit that we've collaborated with CCCADI for this much needed conversation. In addition to Dr. Gilbert Kobina Buhari that Sabine just introduced, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Dosar more formally. He'll be joining our founder in a conversation and dialogue for the majority of our evening. Dr. Kenneth Dosar is a cultural historian, well known for working for social change and community enrichment through writing, lecturing, producing, and teaching courses on Brazil and Afro-Atlantic culture. During his lengthy tenure as a cultural leader in Philadelphia and Bahia, he's collaborated with leading international and national cultural organizations, such as the Center for African and Asian Studies in Bahia, Dance Brazil, CCCADI, the Annenberg Center for Performing Arts in Philadelphia, and National Public Radio. All of this to help produce public events that highlight Afro-Brazilian aesthetics, cultural arts, history, and contemporary issues. He's also very generous of spirit with his wisdom and his presence. We're very honored to have you here with us this evening. I'd like to pass things over to Dr. Buhari for the next portion of our program. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Afia, for that introduction. So this particular dialogue is extremely important to me, and I appreciate CCCADI and Sister Melody, leaders that have worked tremendously hard to get this program going, and I have as well. The spirit of Pan-Africanism has had an incredible resurgence in the past couple of years. It has become quite apparent that Africans on the continent and descendants of Africans in the diaspora can never overcome the plagues of white supremacy in isolation of one another. The only way to do this is for Black and Brown communities to reconcile, reconnect, come together, and understand that because we have a common root, we have a common enemy, common struggle, and therefore a common destiny. Inspired by the senseless killings of Black and Brown bodies over the years by the police, to social justice movements around the world, to movies such as the Black Panther, Ghana, a country known as a leader of Pan-Africanism, called upon the entire Black and Brown community to come to the continent for a year-long event called the Year of Return, 2019. This call was to witness, discuss, and explore the political, economic, and cultural and spiritual possibilities available to us if we indeed united as a Pan-African family. And while we had millions of people, celebrities, scholars, religious and spiritual leaders from all over the Pan-African world answer that call, the Afro-Latinx communities were noticeably absent. This was quite odd because our president in Ghana launched the Year of Return in America, in the Caribbean, in South America. And while there were a few individuals that did attend the Year of Return from the Afro-Latinx community, such as individual celebrities such as Cardi B, the Brazilian and Colombia ambassador with a few delegates, along with CCCADI's own founder, Dr. Marta Morena Vega, who also came to Ghana in 2017 at my request. The Latinx community as a people, it seemed to be quite disinterested. As one of the architects of the Year of Return, an appointed facilitator through the God Box to bring and mobilize religious and spiritual groups to Ghana, I personally wanted to figure out why this was the case, especially since I was well aware that the Afro-Latinx community and leaders have been quite fundamental in creating and facilitating the ideals of Pan-Africanism in the past. So all this has led to partnering with CCCADI to see if we can address these issues and pinpoint what the problem is, and if there actually is a solution to kind of bridging this gap as we continue through the start of the 21st century. While I was thinking about all this, I quickly noticed or realized that in order to stay authentic to the discussion, we had to start the conversation with Africa and its connections to indigenous communities that founded the Americas, such as the Olmecs, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and other North American tribes, all perceived to also have an Afro-Latinx roots. So with that said, we're excited to have Dr. Dasser start us off with a 10-minute presentation that he has put together. And we will go into our discussion and leave the final 30 minutes for Q&A. Dr. Dasser, I will hand over to you.
Hey, thank you so much for the introduction. And more importantly, thank you for the great work that you have been doing in terms of reestablishing the importance of Pan-Africanism, making it more and more visible every day. Thanks also to the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute for bringing me on board with this. The topic we're going to be looking at tonight is very complex. It, in a sense, covers a span from really the beginning of Homo sapiens leaving Africa, moving out into the world, and ending up where we are now. So I have some slides, and we'll move through those relatively quickly. There are some points that I'd like to key into. I'm going to start at the end of the project and then come back to the beginning to tonight. And I start at the end in terms of perspective. Let us all have the same perspective as we move forward and examine the ideas, concepts, the communications between our peoples. So I'm going to begin with an African-American philosophical concept called quilombismo. And this was a philosophy, or is a philosophy rather, that was elucidated by Professor Abdias Nascimento, Brazilian professor who was the first Afro-Brazilian in Brazilian congressional, in Congress, and also the first Afro-Brazilian senator in Brazil. And so if we can have our slides, we can look at the meaning of quilombismo, and it's just a couple other definitions. Besides quilombismo, there's the definition of it, as we'll see, cultural preparation. And although it's a definition and a theoretical perspective, it is exactly what we're doing tonight. We're preparing ourselves culturally to understand the signs and symbols that have been retained and diffused through our various peoples. So this presentation is part of a larger presentation, but we're going to be in a sense just looking at indigenous people. And our first slide says the indigenous people of Pindorama. And Pindorama was the name, the original name given to Brazil by the Tupi-Guarani people, the indigenous people of Brazil. And we'll see also that all of the islands in the Caribbean had their own indigenous names, but we don't typically know them. We might know that Puerto Rico was Borinquen, and Haiti was Quisquia, but all of the islands have these names. So here's quilombismo. Abdias was the architect, and the concept basically states it is a scientific historical philosophy. The focal point is the human being as actor and subject, not as participant and object, okay? Within a worldview in which science constitutes one among many other paths of knowledge. And we know that Western culture basically relies on science as proof. But Abdias is saying that there are other ways of knowing as well, not just scientific. And the key part of quilombismo is that it's rooted in the history, culture, and experience of the group of African descendants. It teaches that liberation must be rooted in a people's cultural identity and historical experience. Quilombismo deals with establishing a society on justice, equality, and in human progress, which is exactly what Professor said, okay? The next definition is cultural preparation, and it's just being able to look at the world and see what we have in common, what resonates with you on a subconscious and soul level. so that if you go someplace and you see something, you'll say, oh, wow, I've been to Haiti and I saw that there. Oh, wow, I was in the Bahamas and I saw that there. So prepare to see what the culture is presenting. Okay, let's move a little quicker if I can. The Americas were populated from two directions. And so if we look here, we'll see that at a certain point in time, this region here was frozen over. And so the people, the Inuit people, are said to have moved down through upper north, what I'm going to call upper North America, this way. And they had ways of traveling down. They came through the mountains, they came over sea coast, they came through streams. But additionally, there was a group of human beings that moved up from South America. They originated in the Amazon Orinoco Rivers region. So you had people moving up. So people moving down and people moving up. Okay, next slide, please. In the Caribbean, there were several ethnic groups. So we all know of the Taino, the Arawak, Kalinago, or Caribs, and the Siboney. It was their ancestors who migrated into the Americas. The Siboney moved through Florida. The Taino Kalinago moved up from Venezuela and Guyana. In South America, below Venezuela and Guyana, were the people, the Tupinamba. Next slide, please. So here we see another representation of that movement where the Taino come up into Cuba, these areas here that become Panama, and then down through the Orinoco and Amazon River. There are Arawak languages in 4 countries in Central America and 8 in South America. So these are large groups of people who speak similar language. The Tupi-Guarana language was spoken in Brazil, is spoken in Brazil. Next slide, please. What did these people believe? They believed in reverence for nature, reverence for ancestors, the belief in protective magic and amulets, the belief in body painting, sacred designs, ingesting medicines, the use of tobacco, nature gods, ancestral spirits influenced their daily lives. Many of these aspects of indigenous religion are replicated in terms of traditional African religions, reverence for nature, reverence for ancestors, protective magic and amulets. Okay, next slide, please. These are the kinds of structure that they lived in, long houses or round houses. They were farmers. Those who were sedentary were farmers. There were nomads as well. They grew maize, cassava, sweet potatoes, cotton, and tobacco. Through contact with Europeans, these groups were decimated, but their influence is found in our languages, in our foods. We have common words like hurricane, tobacco, and hammock have Amerindian origins. Next slide, please. And so here's we see an idyllic artist rendition of indigenous community. We see the Bani painting, we see the hammock, we see the chief or the cacique. Next slide, please. This is a slide, but I think we will just quickly look at this. This talks about the creation story of the Tupinamba. I think that the PowerPoint presentation will be recorded, so we don't have to read this and spend too much time because I think the conversation will be much as fruitful. Next slide, please. Here we see some glyphs. These are what's called the Stonehenge in Puerto Rico. These date back to 1,500 years before the Christian era. Okay, and so these things were around. This is a sports field. This was a typical sports field for Taino people in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. and this is my final slide, and the reason I put this in, these are skulls of bison, of buffalo. This is the United States of America, and this is how the exploiters treated the sacred animal, the food, the clothing, things that were used to sustain life in indigenous America. And this is just, I edited this photo because it goes way up high. So, you know, you judge for yourself what kind of humanity would do something like this. So I just want to give you that sense, and as you know, we'll talk about these things more in detail. But I hope that was a little bit helpful in help setting our perspective and how I see things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Dosser, for that. It's, you know, it's interesting when I saw that that symbol from the Tiano people in Puerto Rico, the Stonehenge. You know, I immediately thought about the symbol of the Sankofa, the Ghanaian, you know, a symbol of coming back, returning to your roots. You know, so that looked very similar.
So you were you're culturally prepared to see that connection. That's why I wanted to use that definition, so that we see where we are and where we have to go.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dosser. So this is I'm really excited about this portion, to hear both of you speak about deeper levels of what you laid out for us, Dr. Dosser. And I think one of the grounding questions that we have is to kind of go a little bit deeper into how these retentions and all the historical aspects influence indigenized cultures, their traditions, and their spirituality. So maybe you can dive a little bit deeper into how you're seeing Africa, the continent, in the things that you laid out. And maybe, Kobina, you can hop in and make some of those connections from your perspective as well, just to help us start building that bridge that you were talking about in the introduction.
Okay. So, you know, we're looking at great spans of time initially, and that it was at least, in some estimates, it was at least 25,000 years ago that the Inuit people began to come into what became North America. So 25,000 years BCE, okay? So we have people moving down in streams, trickling down, walking, taking boats, coming down. And little by little, over these 25,000 years BCE, some of those areas began to settle in and established not just communities, but empires. There's a difference between having a little area where you live or constructing an empire and a civilization. Because so often we get told that anything that is not European is not civilized. We have folks in Congress that say that now, right? That civilization came out of white folks, okay? So here we see, particularly in the Olmec and in Mexico, that there were pyramids built roughly the same time as we had the construction of pyramids in Egypt, okay? So we have these strains of thought, and let me just digress for one moment. We even have folks who said that the pyramids in Egypt were not built by Black folks, but they were built by aliens. You know, so we can't win.
Of course, Black folks can't do that.
Right. Right. And so then you ask about, well, what about the Dogon brother Ogatamele, who mapped out the night sky without telescopes, without any of that so-called sophisticated technology that Europeans have. So this harkens back to what I was saying about there are more ways of knowing than just the scientific method. Okay. And some indigenous folks, so now remember, folks came up out of Africa. It took maybe 5 million years to get up out of Africa and get over to Eurasia and to move around. And so we're talking about long points of time, and people, the Homo sapiens, emerging, evolving. Because before there was Homo sapiens, there were other Homo types of beings, right? And who got displaced or who died out. And Homo sapiens was the winner of this competition for space when the Sahara became dry, because at one point in time, the Sahara was not a desert. People began moving. They moved northward out of Africa up into what becomes Europe, but they also moved over to Australia. So everybody owes their existence to Africa. Humankind started in Africa. We have a lot of people who don't want to acknowledge that, you know. So, you know, I'll stop there and let's get to it.
Yeah, no, you know, that's wonderful. It's, you know, to go back to, you know, to piggyback on what Dr. Dasa, you said, and to go back to your question, you know, I appreciate the connection. Oftentimes when we're speaking about this, and specifically as it relates to the Afro-Latinx community, what I've noticed, and like I said in my introduction, that some of my concerns was it seemed to be a disconnect between you know, the Afro-Latinx community, even though there's connections that they clearly make, and that's why we're here, to really pretty much get a good understanding of, you know, those connections to indigenous cultures and peoples that came in, as, you know, in the Americas, or founded the Americas, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecs. That's sometimes as far as they would go in terms of roots, right? And so I appreciate you making that connection. That of course, you know, what I've normally said is that there's a difference between indigenous and originating, right? And so as you said, you know, we originated in Africa. As we're migrating out of Africa, here we're indigenizing in these spaces, right? And then do so, how we're carrying some of this African retentions. And what I would like to ask you, Dr. Dasa, is, you know, as we're migrating, obviously these African retentions that we're talking about, you know, are we leaving them completely behind, where we're forming this kind of new culture, new religion, new belief, new spirituality that is completely disassociated from Africa? Or, you know, and I'm asking this question because oftentimes, and I think we'll discuss this in panel 2, that, you know, when we're talking about any sort of connection, it's always kind of connected to the Atlantic slave trade, rather than going all the way back to our indigenous spaces in the Americas, and those African retentions there. And so for our audience especially, I think it's important for us to really try to show the difference between being indigenized in these kind of geographical locations and kind of the context and the cultures that erupt from these geographical locations, rather than saying, okay, we originated almost as as a separate species, right? So as you're talking about Homo sapiens, as we're humans, we're coming out of Africa and kind of migrating into these spaces. How do these African retentions, as it relates, as you were talking about, nature, ancestors, magic amulets, you know, the painting, nature gods, animism, things that have been associated still with African traditions, and have almost been demonized in a way by westernized cultures, but we can still find these kind of practices being held amongst the African Latinx community?
Good question. So again, and all of this is complicated by time and say the evolution of culture. Okay, so the folks who walked across the Bering Strait or took canoes down, and now we say, well, maybe those canoes didn't come straight down. Maybe they went to the west and they ended up in the Canary Islands. So how did the Canary Islands get populated with indigenous or original people? Let's call it original people. But all of those people who left those millions, thousands of years ago were not phenotypically African by the time they get into the original, but not that, but through evolution and selective processing, their skin color changed, they develop different languages. And so we talk about, I'm gonna use both. I like that term, original people, because I'm gonna try to incorporate that. So we have these original indigenous folks, right, speaking their own languages to one another. So the Arawak and the Tupinamba language, and then at some point, and it was probably a lingua franca where folks could talk, different groups could talk to one another. Okay, but none of these folks were necessarily speaking Spanish or African-derived languages. There may have been some key terms held over within the collective consciousness of groups, right? And so the cultural piece, on a certain level, changes. It modifies its appearance, but not necessarily its consciousness, its subconsciousness, right? It's archetypical consciousness, all right? It maintains its archetypes, okay? Now, what we don't do is, again, this is about cultural preparation, to be able to look at cultural archetypes, see what they are in one culture and look for them in another culture. Okay, if I can move between time and space for a moment. So you have a group, the Yoruba people, but there's other people in sub-Saharan Africa that were iron workers. Okay, and so there's this deity that comes up out of iron, but also, if we look at our own African American folktales, there's the folktale that talks about John Henry, who was what? A steel driving man. He beat modernization by laying railroad tracks. So I say that, where did this archetype, how did it persist in our minds here?
Right.
Okay. So are these other archetypes and symbols that we have to learn and bring forward and make connections. And I think one other thing, as we begin to address Professor's question, one of my teachers said, like, if you get up in the morning and you go out your house and you're going to do some research, how many directions can you look in to do this research? All right. So think about it. How many directions can you go in? You can look up, you can look down, right, left, forward, and back. That's 6, right? Most important direction is looking inside. Okay, so all of us involved in these conversations have to begin to look inside and say, well, what am I doing that is, if at all, that I'm not supporting this connection, these connections that are so needed for our liberation.
Mhm.
You know?
So, Dr. Dosser, thank you so much. I'm going to take a quick pause and claim a facilitator moment, just catching that there's a bit of a glitch with the chat. So just calling on the rest of the team to see if we can figure out how folks can drop their comments and questions, and also remind the participants that we'd love to hear from you once that's up and running. So give us just a couple minutes to figure out what is up, and we'll get your voices in the mix. In the meantime, Kobe, I'm sorry, I think you were, I don't know if you were going to say something in response to Dr. Dawson.
No, this is, that was pretty deep, Dr. Dawson. When you spoke about consciousness, as we're moving from, as you're saying, our phenotypes, the culture, certain things that are changing naturally, that almost start to move us away from being African, right? And originating in these spaces and claiming that, or those origins, not just being indigenous folks, but originating obviously through generations in these spaces. But one thing that seems to be the retention, the African retention, the thing that sort of remains is the consciousness, right, of who we are as a people. And it makes me think about, when I think about consciousness, I think about spirituality immediate, right? And so our spirituality seems to stay the same, regardless of where we're going. Now, obviously, because of culture and context, it's going to be expressed in different ways, right? But basically, the source of who we are as a people, wherever we're coming from in our origins, stays the same as, and the culture and the context kind of dictates how that's going to look like, or how it's going to be perceived, and rightfully so. I mean, that's what it makes folks indigenous, right, to those spaces. And so I really appreciate that, I think about the founder of CCCADI, Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who often says that, it's not that there's no need to actually reconcile with anything. It's more, we've always remained African. It's about embracing how we've evolved, right? As we're moving into these spaces, and, whether it's, the hybridity, whatever it is that we're focusing on, or whatever that we come in contact with, as you're saying, that too is part of the spiritual journey, right? And that too makes who we are. So I appreciate that aspect that you brought to the table.
Look, in terms of, I just had a thought, in terms of retention, so you may have seen the film Daughters of the Dust.
Yes.
About
great documentary, great movie.
Okay, so now, if we know symbols, there was a moment, and this happens, and this is why we have to be aware and pay attention, really on point. There was a moment in the film where the family was getting ready to the individuals were getting ready to leave and go to the mainland. They were given a turtle, and on the back of the turtle is incised what's called the Yowa. It's a Congo cross, 4 movements of the sun. It's a cross incised on the back of this turtle. Okay, so that just passes by us on screen. Right. What does that symbol mean? Or what does that act of giving mean? When the folks who were leaving get to where they're going, they release the turtle. the turtle comes back to home to let the family know that the people have arrived safely. Because remember, there was no iPhone then.
Right.
You know what I mean? So the
Yes.
turtle was the iPhone. But you see the turtle being given. It's not explained. But if you know the symbols, you'll understand what this means. All right, and where these people originated, the philosophy, even though they may not know it. We have cultural retentions that we do that we may not know the origin. So give an example. A child is never supposed to stand arms akimbo with a hand on each hip in front of an adult. Right? You know what children don't do this in the Black community. Right? Okay, why is that? Because it's a challenge position statement symbol that comes out of Central Africa. Okay? So if you're a child, you don't challenge the adults. But there's also a response to that challenge that the adult does. And so the child does this, and the adult will say, like this, don't you do that. I'm just talking about the non-verbal piece, all right? And that means I admonish you. You're wrong for doing what you're doing. So these things are in our everyday language, everyday physical language, verbal language, and they've been passed down through these originating communities, empires, nations, families, right? We just have to find them and begin to bring them forward, because we're always communicating something to some degree, and we really need to become really aware of, for lack of a better term, and I'll use the best term, our cachet in our words and in our actions, and how we move on this planet, because we're in a situation now that's this world is insane. You know, white supremacy would destroy this planet.
Yeah, and Dr. Dosser, some of the things that you both are saying are making me think about how these maybe seem like small symbols, small retentions matter for us collectively. So, you gave the example of your hands on your hips. And so we can trace these kind of small legacies that show up in our communities. Maybe sometimes they show up as what people call superstitions. I wonder if you two could spend some time exploring more macro level legacies that are still with us, that are retentions from the original people that matter for our socio-political, our economic, our cultural values and our morals. What are the things we've been left with that matter for us and on more communal levels? The way we govern ourselves, the way we value money, maybe the way we value being together and feeding one another. Can you speak a little bit more about that aspect of these retentions, take us from the individual to the more collective as we're trying to build these bridges between these identities?
Professor?
Yeah, no,
Help me out
I think, Afia, you kind of hit it right there in your question. The answer seemed to be right there. One of the things that I think about in terms of what has remained with us in terms of our consciousness is our communal mentality that seems to be very apparent regardless, as long as you're speaking about Black and brown bodies, Black and brown communities, the Pan-African family, how our communal mentality wrestles with this kind of capitalistic, individualistic mentality that seems to derive from a sort of European westernized space. I always say, coming from Ghana, I'm in Ghana right now, that, we've never had, issues or this kind of individualistic mentality of, it's not personal, it's just business. That's oftentimes what you hear, right? Everything in our space is personal. We are literally our brothers and our sisters keepers from a communal sense. And that's something that permeates the African space today. It still permeates our Afro-Latino or Latinx communities today, the Caribbean spaces today. So while the question that you're asking really is focusing on what are the similarities and the commonalities that we still hold and we still retain in these spaces today, that are sort of identifying marks, right? That we can still use to be like, yeah, I mean, I might say something this might sound horrible, but just for the sake of a joke, I hope nobody really takes this seriously. I know my brother, was always talking about, how do we, I would talk to him about Indians, and I'd be like, the Indians they have some African roots or whatever, and then he would say, well, yeah, nah, I don't really believe that, and I would say, well, why not? He'd say, yeah, because they don't really come out and listen to music, loud music, and sit outside like the way black people and Latinx community does. Like, we like to sit outside and listen to music, and and just vibe and be communal, as really vibing with the community and others. So as we're talking about retentions, some of those things, the first thing I'm thinking about is our communal mentality of, when we're in Africa, when we're thinking about our ancient traditions in Africa, nobody really had to ever, there was no such thing as an old people's home. There still isn't anything such as an old people's home, right? Like, you take care of your elders. That's communal. That's something that is an identifying mark that you can use to find those retentions that still exist within the Black and Brown communities, right? So that right there, you see, that's a little different. And even orphanages actually was a kind of a recent phenomenon, right? Nobody ever, the child or your children that you have, regardless of whether they were wanted or not, your child was never yours, right? It was for the community, right? And so that's why the community people can come together, and if they had to discipline the child, your child, the community would do that, right? It's not individual, where from a westernized standpoint, my child is my child and nobody, has the right to discipline or correct, my child. And so the communal aspect, here in Africa, if I'm growing fruits or whatever it is in my space, if we have a mango tree, for instance, a coconut tree, if somehow those branches or the fruit falls into the other neighbor's house, that's theirs, that's for them, you know what I mean? And if it doesn't fall into their house, we will take those, we ourselves would take, the coconut and the fruits and go and give it to them, because this is what it means to be a communal people. And so, I even think about like things, as we're talking about spirituality, things like libation, for instance. While we're pouring libation in Africa from, reverencing our ancestors, you see those retentions that kind of follow us. So whether you're in the Afro-Latinx communities or the African-American communities where, they're pouring out a little liquor, what I mean, for the boys upstate, what I mean, or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, there's still these retentions that we don't do away with, regardless. And as you were saying, Dr. Dosser, it's really about consciousness, right? So one of the things that you've said that I'm thinking about is that doesn't change. A lot of things are affected, the physical, the cultural, the context, and the culture, but but our consciousness, because as you said, there was something that you said, it comes from within, right? That's something that's there, that's not necessarily affected or altered by what's happening from the external, right? But it can dictate, what I mean, what's happening from the external, but it doesn't necessarily change. I think, so to answer your question, if I think that's probably one of the main things that I get from it is our communal mentality versus the capitalistic, individualistic mentality, where it's like, I love you, but I got to pay my rent to me.
Right.
Professor, that's a real good point. Real quickly, we can't be naive and think that our communities, Latinx, Afro-Latinx, African-American, are monolithic, that everybody thinks the same way, it's going to believe the same way, because there's some folks who come out of those communities who will kill you, period. Absolutely. And I mean, we can, I know we talk about tradition, but we can look at what's happening in Georgia now with Herschel Walker. He's an enemy of the people, period. And the folks who want him in power are the enemies of the people. And they see him as the ideal Black man, right? That's very problematic. How did he even get that far, right? So we're not monolithic, right? We don't believe the same things. We have collaborators. So these are things we really need to face. Folks say, "Oh, I'm not going to mess with that voodoo stuff." Oh, that's devil worship. When we talk about spirituality, right? And as you know, in African traditional religions, there's no concept of the devil in any of those religions, right? Yet the world has been put on notice that our spiritual traditions are evil because it's devil worship, right? So how do we, the point about communal living is excellent, but we also know that sometimes the oppressive nature of government on our communities keeps us apart as well, or just keeps us unable to focus. For instance, Jackson, Mississippi, or Flint, Michigan, where folks don't have safe drinking water, right? For years, how does that happen? Where's the internal community leadership? Where's the government? So there's these all of these social problems and needs from healthcare, from education, that keep us from developing the super consciousness. So we're conscious of, well, I got to make that money. I got to go out and make some bread. You know what I mean? But at what cost?
Yeah.
At what cost?
So go on a brief journey with me, if you will. So the things that you all are offering now are really activating my own spiritual imagination. I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like at any point in this wide era that we're exploring now, which is before the disruption of the colonial expansion that led to the transatlantic slave trade. So in that span of some thousands of years, what does it mean to build family, to build community, to practice culture, harbor these values, and protect life, really, with the intention of no end in sight, right? Like we're just building for the future. We're protecting the land for the people who will inherit it, and we're teaching our children what they need to know, and we're putting them in relationship with the elders so that they can be in community with the wisdom, right? We're building these concentric circles of life. And I wonder how our ancestors thought about how to prepare for disruption and fracture, which are some of the things that you both are lifting up, right? Like death happens when it shouldn't, and political forced displacement, all of these kinds of violences that we're experiencing today. But here we are, right? Retaining, here we are holding on to these things. So I'd love to know what each of you is most grateful for as you sit as two men right now in this country and in whatever countries you are in the world. When you think about all of the struggles that our people are facing, and you look back to this era, what's a value, what's a practice, what's an aspect of the culture that's been protected through these thousands of years that you're most grateful for? What's helping us stay grounded and together and whole from your perspective?
Wow. That's a hard question. And
You can pick more than just one.
so, Du Bois talked about the talented 10th, right? So there, and not to form a hierarchy, but there are forces in our communities that are out of control, absolutely out of control. Philly has always been a tough city. Philly, where I live, has always been a tough city in terms of gangs. And it's really tough now in terms of young folks just shooting people to be shooting people, right? Okay, so how do we handle that? Do we have a mechanism within our cultural remembrance to deal with that? Because clearly the educational system and the social system has failed these young men, typically young men. The police system has a target on their backs, and we have a target on our backs. Everybody got a target on their back, right? So how do we stay safe? So one of the things Dr. Vega says is that work with people who share your vision. Okay, so people who share the vision come up with the God Box Foundation, right? And the work that they do, and you amplify that out. Okay. Everybody ain't gonna be saved. That's the other piece. And I mean, as I look back and look forward, and this is gonna sound a little depressing, but it also may be forewarning. I look at what's happening between white and white folks and folks of color the same way, with the same kind of trepidation that our ancestors looked at when they saw those ships offshore, right? We are in a similar kind of position. And we got, if you Scott Heron talked about whitey's on the moon, right? So there's all of this technology that we don't have access to, but technology can work two ways. I mean, it can work the technocrat. So we're not monolithic. We need to work with people who share our vision. We need to increase our vision. We need to come up with new methods. We need to come up with new methods of education, medicine. I give you an example. This is going to seem a little crazy, but follow me through. You go to sleep at night, and you wake up and you say, "Oh, it's cold in here," so you cover up. Or you wake up and you say, "I'm cold," right? Your body is reacting to a physical stimulus. But how many of us go to bed and don't turn the television off? And our minds are constantly being, for lack of a better term, disturbed by that information, whatever it is, could be music. But we were made to rest at some point in time. You know, so I've talked to people who say, well, I can't sleep without the television on. Woo, that's serious, right? Right? You can't give your mind rest. You know, what is it that has changed so much within us or causes this disturbance that we cannot sit in silence, rest in silence? Okay. So we need to have multifaceted approaches. One of the things that, you know, I spent a lot of time in Brazil. One of the things that was really fascinating to me, it brings me to tears. 10 years ago, the federal universities had to had to set aside seats for Black and brown students. Those young folks who came out of poor communities in the favelas have PhDs now. They're speaking 2 and 3 languages now, right? So I have more faith now in Brazil and what's happening there with the re-election of this president, and having talked to some of these young folks. So how do we stimulate our young people to get out of this? You know, America's about being dumb. You hear people about dumbing down, and they didn't like Obama for any number of reasons, one of which was because he was smart. You know, let him and Trump take a IQ test to see who scores the highest, right? Whose policies have done the most for humanity on this planet. So I'm just saying that how do we inspire our young people quickly? I mean, we're like that myth of Superman, you know, where the planet's getting ready to be destroyed, and they wrap the baby in a blanket and put him in a rocket ship and send him out. Well, we have to send our kids out fully prepared, protected.
Yeah. There's a lot there. You know, when I'm thinking about this particular theme and this topic, you know, some of the things, and I'm sure we're going to touch on this panel too. You know, I think about what are some of the things, again, the disconnect that exists, where we have indigenous folks, because we can say, and we have, you know, for Olmecs and Aztecs, Mayans, and those where Afro-Latinx community can find those roots in those indigenized spaces way before the Atlantic slave trade. You know, we have, you know, you're seeing that kind of conversation, Dr. Dosser, you know, as we're talking about even African Americans, as we're bringing them into the conversation, where on one hand you have a separate group of folks that are saying, that are also claiming to be indigenized in the Americas just as much as the Olmecs, you know, and the Aztecs and North Americans, the Mayans and others. And then you have another group of African Americans who are also, you know, kind of trace their roots in the Americas through the Atlantic slave trade, right? And I bring that up because one of the things that I've noticed is the conversation, as I started in the introduction, the conversation around, you know, you have African Americans that are looking, you know, their experience is quite unique through the Atlantic slave trade, and we'll touch on this a little bit, but their experience is quite unique in terms of what was taken away from them, right? Where we have, you know, after Afro-Latinx community, where there might be some experiences there, but their culture, you know, certain things that they have been willing to embrace and indigenize in those spaces where there's not this sense that there's anything really missing, right? Or there's anything So immediately once we brought up this topic, for instance, a lot of the conversation that I was hearing and responses that I was hearing from the Afro-Latinx community was, yeah, we're sort of indigenous in these spaces, and so there isn't something that's really lacking, where, so embracing, even though we're embracing the African spirituality, that is something that is really interesting, because that's not something that is done away by the Afro-Latinx community or the Caribbean community. The African spirituality is there. And so, as you were saying, the consciousness is there. Oftentimes, that's actually missing from the African American community, right? Rather than, so we hold these spaces, and so there's this. But I wonder how does that affect the participation within Pan-Africanism, meaning that when, there seems to be there's no issue really within the Afro-Latinx community as it relates to finding self, or, retrieving names, retrieving culture, some of the things that maybe the African American community is sort of struggling with and is still seeking, because these things were taken away from them. With the Afro-Latinx community, it's like, no, this is the hybridity is also part of who we are, and we've embraced that space. We've embraced those cultures and traditions. So we're not necessarily wrestling with this idea of reconciling, right? Even that word, for instance, sort of assumes that there's been this sort of this detachment, and from the Afro-Latinx community, especially from traditionalists, spiritualists, and other leaders from that community. It's sort of like, no, there's no sort of reconciliation. We've always been linked. It's just a kind of evolving in these spaces and these contexts and cultures. And that's who we are, and they've embraced that. And sometimes I think about that and I wonder, does that do a disservice to the efforts of Pan-Africanism, right? Where it's like, wait, no, we need the Afro-Latinx community to join in these efforts. And as I was saying before, when you look at the history of Pan-Africanism, we had a lot of the Afro-Latinx community and leaders that not only were co-creators of Pan-Africanism, facilitated these spaces as well. And we're not necessarily seeing that within the 21st century, where there's sort of this kind of complacency that exists because we're comfortable who we are, and we're not wrestling the way that maybe African Americans are still wrestling with identity. And so the question of identity, I think, is something that, as we're talking about, kind of, is really, a focus for me, is that, do we need to struggle with identity in order to take part in Pan-Africanism? Or can we be fully confident in who we are, what we've become, how we've evolved as the Afro-Latinx community, and also Caribbean folks? And I like to contrast that, because whilst Caribbean folks, let's say the Black Caribbean, for instance, also is quite confident in who they are, have embraced, their context and culture and geographical locations, they're still very much involved with Pan-Africanism as it relates to connecting with the continent of Africa. So contrasting them with the Afro-Latinx community, where it's the same kind of confidence, but then it's sort of, because we are in these spaces and we are indigenized in these spaces in the Americas and the Caribbean, that there might not be a need for that kind of involvement within the Pan-African space of trying to connect again. For me personally, the reason why I feel there's a need is because, again, as I said in the introduction, a lot of our struggles, our common struggles, and what we're wrestling with can't be overcome in isolation. Right, we have to find a way to come together. Oftentimes we forget that Europeans and white folks came together in order to do what they did. And so, they can call themselves Germans or whatever it is, but at some point they realized they needed to be one in order to be able to do or achieve what they wanted to achieve. And after that, then they kind of split up again, right? But, how do we, as we're engaging the Afro-Latinx community and trying to bring them into, the kind of the 21st century Pan-African eruption that has started. How do we? What are some of the things that we can touch on that brings the Afro-Latinx community and say, yes, you're comfortable with who you are, but and you're indigenized in these spaces as we've discussed through the anthropological levels, physical anthropology, cultural anthropology. But how do we still maintain this connection where we recognize that we still have to come together because we still have this root, and we have if we have this common root, we have a common destiny, we have a common enemy, we have these common struggles, and we need to come together. And case in point, we can look at the Haitian Dominican kind of conversation right there, which is, right in the heart of what we're discussing. That is like a clear, apparent kind of wrestle, that is still going on today, historically, and still going on today. How is it that we're having this common struggle? We're struggling with this, but yet somehow we don't see that we are the same people, and we need to come together to overcome this common enemy.
Well said, very well said. The Haitian Dominican piece is symptomatic of white superiority being internalized and applied through the political system, and then talk about in the Dominican Republic. So the question of identity is important, very, very important. Years ago, there was in a sense more distance between our communities because Black folks didn't necessarily grow up learning or speaking Spanish. All right, but that's changed in the last 30, 40 years, and clearly there were some connections during the Jazz age when folks were going back and forth between, say, New Orleans and Cuba and whatnot. But in general, this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but I live in Philadelphia. The public schools aren't educating our kids to speak English, let alone Spanish. I mean, not really, and folks are just waiting for to be able to retire. The discipline in the school, in the school itself, schools are dangerous. So how do you learn in those kinds of situations? And it's dangerous for both Latinx students and African-American students. But your point is that we need each other. That's the point. And how do we make one another available, or make ourselves available to the other? All right, because we have been otherized by Europeans, people of color, particularly non-Christian people of color are the other, and Europeans came here to civilize those. Okay, so we enter in to Christian religious practice. We're still not accepted in many places, right? So these are big issues that we really have to, how long, what do we need? 2 generations, 3 generations? Do we have that enough? Do we have enough time? Give you an example of education problems. I was doing a presentation on white supremacy and police brutality in the US and Brazil. And I showed a slide that talked about a history book, quote from a history book. Student brought it home, African-American student brought this book home to show their parents. And it said Africans were brought from Africa as workers to work in agriculture. That was it. Okay, so you take that book, if it's not found out and called out, it stays in the school system of Texas, right? And then you got folks talking about, well, critical race theory. Well, you can't teach this, you can't teach that, can't teach that. So we're starting to stifle free speech, the ability to learn. So these are big issues that these folks have spent maybe 2 generations refining. You know, there was a white supremacist named Metzger who told folks, his believers and followers, said, look, keep your mouth shut and get into positions of power. They're there now, you know, in all kinds of positions of power, not just the police, but all the way up to the Senate. And somebody who thinks that they could run for president again.
Yeah, Dr. Doster, yeah, thank you both for that last little bit. I like to think that the work we're doing together is part of the antidote to all of that, breaking open more space for crucial conversations, and based on some of the comments in the chat, also just helping folks find some resources and strings to follow in their own journey of weaving through these things. So just want to name and honor that this is a drop in the bucket of like equilibrium, given the context that we're discussing. So I want to lift up a couple of the questions and comments that have been coming through in the chat. Thank you to the folks who are engaging in that space. I'm going to start with this one from Deborah, which is, how can the Afro-Latino community take steps towards opening up their hearts to speak about spirituality, understanding spirituality from an African perspective, and see how they connect? Hispanic and Afro-Latinos, the majority practice evangelical dogmas that I believe are crippling the community and seem to be like another form of oppression. So can you all dive into Deborah's question and comments there? Very praxis oriented, which feels like right on theme with where you all are headed in your conversation.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, folks believe what they've been programmed to believe. Typically, folks might move. You enter a spiritual tradition either through your parents. At some point in time in your life, you decide, I'm going to stay here, or you go, you know, with that, or I'm going to explore and see what else is out there that really speaks to me. I've been given the discipline from my parents, but I'm not so much into this practice. I want to look at this one. And so we have folks, Black and brown folks, who practice Hinduism and Buddhism. Okay, so whatever speaks to a person's spiritual being, their self, their soul, all right? And by being aware of life itself, these questions, it's hard to, I think once your eyes are open, it's hard to close them. There's a statement in Kikongo called Bula Meso. It means to have your eyes open. And it's something that's said when you go through an initiation, because typically your eyes might be closed and then you open your eyes and you see the world different. Okay, but what might bring people to that awareness of, I need to see the world differently? And I think there's a lot of distractions. There's a cold-blooded book by Machiavelli, The Prince, that says, if you keep people not focused on what really needs to be done. If you keep them distracted, they won't be able to solve all the problems. They won't see what you're doing to them, right? So what are our distractions? Well, the Bachelorette, football, and I'm not against football, or soccer, right? I am against oppression, right? So other distractions, how do our artists really reach forward from their creative essence and touch the souls of people in a way that's uplifting? How do we to uplift? Because we can, as a writer or poet or whatever, you can talk about anything you want. But if you really don't know that you can write words to uplift people and give them visions of a better future, then you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Dawson, are you saying that you think that creative expression and art are one of the ways that people can start to kind of slowly become aware of the reality that's been given to them?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that the Caribbean Cultural Center is built on, this idea of creative expressions. All of this is coming out of the subconscious, and your subconscious is connected to your ancestors, right? So this idea of looking at Black art, Black music, black and brown, let me not just say black and brown. So here's a synchronicity. The African-American poet Langston Hughes was in touch and corresponded with the Afro-Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen. And Guillen wrote Fire. And he has a poem, it's called It's All Very Well. And he goes through this poem, he talks to the African-American, he says, well, Black men of the North, it's all very well that you do this, that you have civil rights marches. And at the end of the poem, he says, but if this is not working, then I suggest get a gun. He said, if you don't have a gun, get a rock. If you don't have a rock, get a stick. And if you don't have to get a stick, get something, do something, right? And so what I'm saying is that everybody doesn't have to get on board, but the trains, it may have left already, and we're running to get on it. So art, culture, self-awareness, self-healing, how can I be better? It's a simple thing. Ask yourself, how can I do better tomorrow than I've done today? Simple.
Yeah.
And once we start looking at ourself, and I don't mean this self, I mean this self, things will start to speak. You'll start to meet folks. Things will show up. That's what I think.
Yeah. No, yeah, and just to add to follow up on that real quickly, the question to me, and it's funny, you brought CCCADI. I mean, this is why I'm glad that this discussion is happening on this platform, because again, this is about, the question again surrounds almost or suggests that there's a disconnect again with spirituality. And who we are, a spirituality that, is kind of has never changed, as we've been talking about, has never changed from who we are as African people, but has kind of evolved in these spaces. And now we've kind of, met, whether it's Christianity or other, westernized kind of values and cultures. And now we have to wrestle with that. So how do we speak about spirituality? I think the question was, or understanding spirituality from an African perspective, right? And I think CCCADI does a brilliant job of that through the arts and the culture and the music and all of that. That's exactly how we speak to it, and how we combat whatever dogma. I think it was evangelical dogmas, or so that question kind of came from a kind of westernized Christian space, where there's a wrestle there. And you said something, Dr. Dawson. You said subconscious is connected to the ancestors, right? And so if here we are, and as you spoke about consciousness, as we're moving, the consciousness doesn't change, and therefore our ancestors are forever with us everywhere we go. And therefore, and so that spirituality remains the same. And then it might look different. It might have to wrestle with other ideals and notions and beliefs and other things, but it's going to be expressed in different ways. And so, I think Deborah's question of, these evangelical dogmas that are crippling the community, and it's like another form of oppression. Again, it's a form of oppression because these kind of westernized beliefs and cultures are cloaked as a universal religion, right? Are cloaked as universal beliefs, yes. Are cloaked as universal values, are cloaked as universal morals. And so, all of a sudden when we're in our own indigenized spaces, and somehow we have to deal with what is assumed to be universal, we're always going to have this clash. And I think what CCCADI does, what the God Box does, is really embrace our own indigenized spaces, understand that to stay true to our culture and context, embrace it. And if I may, since this question seems to come from a kind of Christianized space, I think Jesus says something along the lines in the Gospel of Thomas that whatever is in you, you have to kind of bring out of you, right? And if you don't bring it out of you, then that same thing that is in you will destroy you, right? And so there's a necessity to bring out who we are, reveal it, be proud of it, and never, look at it as somehow inferior. I think, Dr. Dawson, you started off saying folks that didn't understand our civilizations. It wasn't that we weren't, the definition of civilization is the art to be civil, right? And there's nothing civil about war and killing and terror and other things. But here they are coming into spaces where they may not understand. It wasn't that we weren't civil or we didn't have civilizations. It's just that they may not have understood it. And therefore here we are having to struggle against oppression or, other forms of oppression, as our sister Deborah said. And so, we should never, to answer that question, understanding our spirituality from an African perspective is key. And platforms such as the God Box and CCCADI clearly is about, bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, thank you both. And on that same front, that not only are the platforms available, but also resources. So I'm seeing folks also ask some questions about resources for engaging these conversations with loved ones and people who they're close to, resources for just kind of navigating their own personal journey, as well as resources for this particular topic. So I wanted to make a note quickly for the participants that upon registration, you should have received access to the resource library that we've been curating as we've been preparing these panels. There are suggested readings. Some readings are made available to you because some of the texts about this particular era are pretty difficult to come across, which is a different conversation about access to information and our histories. But you should be able to access those things. If you're not able to find a way to link to those, please drop that question in the chat or send an email to our team so we can get you what you need. And in the same vein, I want to lift up a question from Solida, which, I mean, I guess it's a different vein, but still on this kind of praxis theme. Solida asked, is there a way for us to unite that is beyond struggle? She'd love to hear more about what we could create together that would sustain the future for our children and allow them to know that they're free instead of spending their whole lifetime unlearning these things.
That is, Dr. Dosser, if I may, that is, I love that question because that immediately, for me, makes me think or assumes that it makes me think about how I was thinking about this whole, putting this whole thing together and how we try to remove white folks and Europeans from the conversation, right? And so when I think about is there a way for us to unite that is beyond struggle? As long as we have Westernism, white folks, part of the conversation, we're going to have to struggle with it. We're going to have to wrestle with it. I think about, I think it was Booker T. Washington who said, folks are asking, what should we do with Black folks? And he says, do nothing with us, right? Is that leave us alone.
Alone.
I think there was a part in Malcolm X's movie as well where, the white student comes in and says, I would love to help. What should I do? And it's like, do nothing, right? Is that here, as long as a lot of these conversations are always surrounded around the wrestle between what we're going through. Hence, Sister Deborah's question, the wrestle that what we're going through with what, this kind of universal, kind of westernized, Europeanized, world that we're living in, and we constantly have to struggle with that. So how do we move beyond that? Is for me, is simply to stop being in conversation with white supremacy, Europeans and others. How do we start to speak to each other? And that's why, as we're speaking, we're, this whole project, these conversations are, we understand that they're reflective, but then there's a praxis that's behind it. So we're not just talking and we're going to have these, 4 panels of discussion, but we're also moving beyond the discussion and we're saying, all right, whilst we're having the discussion, how do we move? How do these discussions play out on the ground? Right? If we're actually, it's one thing to talk about this, but does this actually work on the ground in praxis? And so, this is where folks are going to be called out, because we can have these discussions, but it's also calling you to act, right? And so the question of, especially, I think the question about, I think within that question was, our children's future. And we're constantly spending so much time trying to unlearn something, right? Rather than going in and embracing and learning what has always been there, right? So there's this long struggle. I think one of our elders likes to say that, when you're driving somewhere, it always seems, especially for the first time, it's a long drive. It always seems like it takes forever to get there. And then when you're driving back, it's like, it seems shorter, right? And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm looking at in terms of, you know, here we are, we're trying to get back to something. We're trying to connect with who we are. I do believe that that journey is going to be shorter because it's always been there. And it's really imperative for us as a people to, again, start to look at each other, have discussions with each other, and stop engaging each other with those sort of, as Sister Deborah was saying, the dogmas or certain things that have kind of influenced our thinking, our morals and values. It's really about coming to the center of African spirituality and then moving from there. I mean, a lot of our God Box talks that we have, one thing I noticed was initially when we started years ago, we would bring all these folks that are coming from different faith spaces and religious spaces, spiritual spaces. And they would come, and the idea immediately was, whether they were scholars or faith leaders, spiritual leaders, was to defend where they were coming from, right? And I noticed that, well, that's not necessarily interfaith discussion or multi-faith discussion. It's about embracing your differences and then using those differences as wealth that is meant to be shared, so that we can understand, we can embrace our differences, but we also understand that this difference that we may have, this person might have a different answer to a different kind of problem. And so how do we come together as a united front, remove this long age conversation? I know we constantly speak about, you know, the way white folks or Europeans maintain their supremacy is through their silence, whilst we're constantly talking about this. And so I think that I think it's important for us to come together. The only way we, I think that the answer really is there, to unite beyond the struggle, right? Look, I hate that term, keep the struggle alive. You hear that term a lot, keep the struggle alive. It's like, well, how do we liberate ourselves if we're supposed to keep this struggle going, right? And so we're kind of caught up in this space where we think, and the struggle, needless to say, makes a lot of money. The rhetoric of it, gives us a purpose. And a lot of folks are kind of engaged in that space because sometimes they don't want to take that responsibility that requires to remove yourself from the struggle and then actually have to deal with each other in order to move forward. So I think, in order, to answer that question, especially as it relates to our children's futures, I think, we have an opportunity through these kind of platforms and dialogues to come together as a people, move beyond the struggle, which is really about doing away with, the kind of westernized kind of European space and deal with each other, have honest conversations. I think if you, as you spoke about what we're about, remove the mutual suspicion that seems to exist amongst each other, right? That's what we need to start talking about, because, well, as long as we keep talking about other folks, we're not talking or dealing with ourselves. And I think it's, part of what Pan-Africanism is. And part of the issue with the how we bring Afro-Latinx communities within the Pan-African space in the 21st century deals exactly with that.
Yeah,
Well
thank
said.
you.
Well said again. I have a couple of real quick points that go back a little bit. So one point is this idea of you had talked about spaces. And so there's a Yoruba village in South Carolina, Oyotunji, all right?
Yeah.
It's a place that can be visited. But folks will say, but I'm not going there. I'm not going to do that. Why would I want to go to, it's a village. it's, you know, I'm modern. Same token, you have, I believe it's in Tennessee, I might be wrong. They've created Noah's Ark there. Nobody's talking about that, and folks going to go see Noah's Ark. And I know some Black folks is going, I'm saying like, oh, have you been to the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York? No, but you're gonna go to, you're gonna go see Noah's Ark in Tennessee? You know, that's problematic. The other thing is to those of you who can travel, take your phone with you, take some pictures, you know, if you can. And there are folks who are out there who travel. Unfortunately, one of our favorite modes of travel is the cruise to the Caribbean, where we don't have to engage with folks who don't speak, who speak English. You know, well, I don't want to go. People say, I don't want to go to a place where they don't speak English. Well, you know, that's a little bit ethnocentric, I think. All right. And everybody can't travel. I understand that. But if you have a son or a daughter, or sons or daughters who are in college, get them into study abroad programs in the Black world. Talk to a student, African-American student, or Latino student, say, well, yeah, I'm studying abroad. Well, where you going? Oh, I'm going to France. You know, I'm saying, okay, there are other places to go. All right. So you go, you come back, and then you start with these small groups. You have some pictures. You invite folks over to your house or your apartment, or if you're living with friends, your room, you know, and you begin to share, right? Or if there's a good film, let's say when you know, if everybody's in love with Wakanda Forever, you know, we invite people over, see the film, talk about the symbols and talk about that. What else can we do? Or finally, where is the Black and Brown Museum in the city that you live in? You know, go there, invest in their programs and in your future. I think that's important.
Yeah.
And just to add really quickly to that, because there's, you know, two things, you know, you said, you know, I know she's gonna hate me. I have a very good friend. She's the founder of an organization called I Am Culture. And so I hope she's okay with me saying this. I'm giving her some publicity here, but you know, we had, you know, some struggle because, you know, that her whole organization was about taking, you know, Black and brown folks from you know, our communities and you know, having them travel around the world. Now, initially, when I heard about the organization I Am Culture, I don't know why, but for my mind, you know, because she was dealing with Black and brown folks, I was thinking, okay, I Am Culture means, you know, she's taking them to, you know, the African continent, you know, and experiencing different spaces. And I remember when I started to get a good understanding of what she was doing, yes, she would have some, you know, trips to Africa, but it was really around the world. They would go to Rome, they would go to France, they would go to all these other places, and we would have arguments. Because I'm like, yeah, don't you think, you know, we've been kind of indoctrinated enough with Westernism and Europeanism? You know, if you have this kind of organization, you know, won't you, you know, aren't you more, you know? And, you know, we would have this argument. You know, what was interesting is after, you know, taking a couple of our people to Africa, she noticed that there was a huge difference with, you know, taking, you know, our folks to Rome or France and others, and these are children, right? These are children that are going to these spaces that she's taken, and then the experiences and what they leave with when they come to places in Africa, right? And what it means to them. And so she came back to me and said, wow, you know, like we had this argument, but, you know, naturally she's recognized that there's a huge difference, that coming to Africa for the kids means so much more because they're seeing something that really touches them, because they're seeing people that look like them. They sort of expect what they see when they go to Rome and France and all those other kind of European or Scandinavian countries. But when they come to Africa, it means something different. So right there, it's something. And then another thing, you said was the Wakanda Forever movie, which, obviously that was really interesting, because to have the Black Panther movie and then have the Wakanda movie, which actually brought in, I believe, the Mayan civilization and culture, where on one hand, they were showing, again, what we're discussing, the common enemy, the common struggle, our common roots, similar religio, cultural, spirituality that exists amongst us. And yet somehow through the propaganda, they always find a way to have us fight each other rather than the common enemy. And, that we clearly have in the name of some sort of morality or, values that we're holding, and yet we don't hold those moralities and values when it comes to dealing with each other. And so, when we're in these spaces through the movies, through the cartoons, through the media, all these spaces are constantly, indoctrinating us, and really trying to enter into our subconscious.
Absolutely.
So that we can do away with our ancestors, right? And do away with our ancestral traditions, the space that they hold, so that we can eventually never see each other as one or united, which is probably their worst fears.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I think this last point is powerful. It reminds me of, I think it's called the contact hypothesis in sociology, which is like things are fearful to people when they don't have access and contact to them. And the more contact they get with the thing, the deeper it sinks into their being, the more normal it becomes, the less fearful it becomes. And that's almost what we have to do to repair ourselves, is continue to put ourselves in repetitive contact. Images of Black and brown folks getting together, more things like this, reading the books, watching the documentaries, visiting the art galleries, all kinds of, we watch and have a sense of how it's being done and targeted at us. We can apply the same strategy in a healing capacity to just pepper our lives with the images, the sounds, the stories that are about us and for us and center us in our wholeness. So thank you both for this exploration, and thank you to the folks who have participated. A special shout out to all the folks who are engaging in the chat. I'm just noticing that we're in our last couple of minutes, so I want to do a couple of housekeeping things in case folks missed the chat. When you registered for this evening and the concurrent sessions, you had to create a profile on the tour web, or the panel website. It's spiritualpilgrimage.tours. If you log back into that portal, you'll have access to the resource library. Every panel has its own set of resources. It includes art, it includes YouTube links, it includes readings. So we encourage you all to take your own time moving through those resources. They're available for you to use at your own pace. I also want to encourage you to stay in touch with both the CCCADI and the GodBox team as you have questions. There were quite a few rich comments that I know that we would love to engage with, just don't have the time right now, but we're at this point, we're committed to a long journey together. So this is session 1 of 4, plus the pilgrimage tour to Ghana next summer. So just naming that we'll be in conversation with one another for some time. So please take advantage of your access to both the panelists as well as the teams at the CCCADI, at CCCADI and on the GodBox side. We're here to be on that journey together. So please dive in and let us know how we can support you. Panelists, we've got a last few minutes. Is there any last remark that you want to leave folks with before we depart, keeping in mind that we have about 2 months before we'll be together again?
I'm going to miss you all. But I'd like to, we've talked about, we've used the term white supremacy. And one of the terms that I'd like to bring forward is also patriarchy in a white supremacist system, the father's rule, and particularly for the negative that it does, and how much it is integrated into Christian, let me not say Christian, Abrahamic religions. Father's rule, God the Father rules. There's a patriarch, in a religion, or the Pope. There's the father of the family. All of this is to keep the woman in her place, right? So these words we need to take with us: white supremacy and patriarchy. And let's erase them from this universe.
Yeah, no, and just to add to that, I mean, yeah, that's something that we definitely will be tackling in panel 2. It's always it's been mind-boggling, really, how that patriarchy really has become more associated with our African traditions rather than Westernized traditions. In our African spaces, we've actually always had a kind of matriarchal tradition. And so I'm glad that you mentioned Abrahamic traditions that have kind of brought up this kind of, patriarchal notions and kind of, kept it. Obviously, we'll dive into that a bit because I think it's a real necessary discussion. But I would say, I'm very excited. I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I think folks that joined us as well, I think really enjoyed it. And for those that maybe had trouble registering, and we know we had a couple of folks that had some trouble registering. Hopefully, we can resolve those issues so that we can have even more folks on panel 2. But this is a great discussion. In my opinion, this is quite a historic beginning to something that I think has been long overdue. And I really appreciate CCCADI for giving us this platform, partnering with us to discuss this much needed issue. And again, we're not just talking about this in reflection, but we're also going to translate this into praxis. And so, I'm hoping that folks stay through all, throughout these discussions, as, it only gets better from here.
It only gets better. Well, thank you both so much. I know you can't hear the participants, but they're giving lots of gratitude and celebration for you both in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Please follow both CCCADI and Godbox on social media. Move the conversation there. Email us, connect with one another, dive deep, and be good to yourself and each other. And we will see you all in February.
All right.
Peace.
Thank you. Peace.